So today I wanted to do a two-part review and start off with Island of the Fishmen, which is obviously another merman film. The film is directed by Sergio Martino and is distributed by Medusa Distribuzione, which is a fairly creative and inventive film, but I definitely find it very flat and dull, unfortunately. It definitely starts off fairly interesting. You have a scientist who has come to a deserted island with his daughter. Along the way, we have some evil character who supposedly happens to be funding his experiments, but is really more interested in having the mermen excavate the lost treasure from the city of Atlantis, which supposedly was discovered under the island. So obviously the evil benefactor Rackham is holding Amanda, the inventor's daughter, hostage. Along the way we do have some shipwreck inmates, I guess you could say, and obviously one of them does take a liking to Amanda. He is, I believe, is supposedly the one who is not actually an inmate but happens to just have been on the same ship as the inmates. And obviously they take somewhat of a liking to each other. The cover of the film is very interesting looking for. Having been released in 1979, it definitely has a very exploitation film quality about it, but really the closest you ever really get is seeing a drenched woman in a white undershirt. So yeah, don't get yourself too excited over that. But yeah, like I've said, the film is fairly dull. It moves fairly slowly, and I generally do not mind films with a slow build. I actually prefer them because you get to know the characters better. You get to actually develop the story before anybody actually dies. Early on, we do have a few cheesy deaths. We have a merman, or a fishman as they refer to these creatures, who comes out of the reeds and attacks one of the men. We assume that they've been either eaten or devoured or who knows what. Later on we actually do meet the men who have been taken hostage, and we realize that no, they've just become more experiments. So it's definitely interesting the way this turn happens. Obviously the doctor, his whole premise in creating these fishmen was in order to alleviate the world's dwindling food supply, which is extremely forward-thinking considering the film takes place in 1891. And I don't think anyone was anywhere near running out of food during that time period. I think now we're getting a little closer to being a little more in trouble, but yeah, if people would quit having kids, that would probably help. So along with Rackham, he has a servant who is somewhat of a voodoo priestess who has foretold the demise of the island, and she believes that Amanda, who has grown up on the island, is considered part of the island, and in order to appease the gods, she must die with the island. Obviously, Rackham is not in agreement with this because he still has somewhat of a fancy for Amanda, and obviously the priestess Shigira is murdered due to wanting to sacrifice Amanda. Unbeknownst to everyone is the fact, obviously, later on, most people do discover that the fishmen were manufactured, but there's also somewhat of a potion that they have to take in order to maintain themselves. Amanda, who travels out at night in order to give this potion to the mermen, not only maintains their biology, but somewhat allows her a control over these fishmen creatures in order for them to be better controlled or manipulated. Toward the end of the film, it's obvious some time has passed since they've actually had their potion, and they do become a lot more feral. They even strike out and attempt to attack Amanda. As the island does sink, Rackham obviously is trying to have them bring up the last of the treasure before leaving, and they do as they're told, but eventually Rackham does meet his demise, and we do have Lieutenant Claude de Ross, the other doctor who came along with the inmates. He and Amanda do manage to escape, but not without the help of the fishmen, which to me is somewhat of a plot hole because they've turned feral, but somehow they've managed to maintain some sort of consciousness in order to save her. So Island of the Fishmen did have a US release. It was retitled Something Waits in the Dark. The film did not do too well, and I believe it was remarketed as Screamers, and there was a scene in which, in the opening trailer, There was an attack in which a man is turned inside out. I have no idea how in the world that happens, but moviegoers who went to see the re-release with that version were obviously disappointed because the film did not feature that scene. It was only used for the trailer. So obviously they demanded that the scene be included. Luckily, the producers did resend the film in order to have that scene printed back in, but that scene never made the actual home video version. To my knowledge, only the Italian version is the one which still exists, which is Island of the Fishmen. Unfortunately, in 1995, Sergio Martino decided to do a television film, a sequel to Island of the Fishmen, known as The Fishmen and Their Queen. To my knowledge, that film was never aired in the US. It is quite of a hassle trying to find a copy of the film, and for good reason. If you're not able to find it, you are better off not watching it. I honestly regret watching the movie. It's not only just badly written, there's poor character development. The lead characters in this film, because the film is set in somewhat of a cross between a medieval, futuristic, post-apocalyptic world, if you can make any sense of that. So we definitely do have somewhat of a hierarchy. There's some armed men running around on horses just trying to maintain order, but the two lead characters, the boys in the film, they actually live in the sewers. They survive off of rats. We also have somewhat of a death racers who just serve as entertainment for the, I guess you could say, the higher order, the horse riding men. So you definitely have a caste system going on. The kids in the film, I think, are over-exaggeratedly ignorant. One of the boys in the film says that before the bomb and everything else happened, he did go to school. I believe he said he went up to 5th grade. And he does seem to have some knowledge over things. There was another boy who said that he grew up in the sewer and knows absolutely nothing, but they're the same age range, which logically makes no sense. I don't think anyone would grow up in a sewer until after the apocalypse happens. So that just kind of leaves me a bit off, like, okay, you're trying too hard to feign ignorance, or major loophole there. Along in the sewers, there is somewhat of an evil messiah preacher type fellow who looks like Fu Manchu, and apparently some woman which lives with him which happens to look like a Cenobite, which is mildly amusing, I guess you could say. But the boys decide to flee the sewer and get out of New York. They want to live somewhere a little more safe, so they do fight their way past the horse riding men, and they wind up in some sort of a junkyard. They, for some reason, pick up a book because they think it's great rat catching bait, and we realize that later on this is some sort of a prophecy type book, which for some odd reason tends to foretell events in the film. Everyone seems to take a fascination with this book. Everyone except those boys seems to happen to know what it is, which to me is extremely odd, because why is it dumped in a junkyard, just disregarded? So the boys do meet up, and they do run across one of those race car drivers. He helps them break out because he actually feels that it's the boy's weight that weighs down the car and helps him to actually evade the traps, which are really exaggerated. I don't think they were actually animated laser beams. They look more like a flashlight type effect. I guess similar to something that you would have seen in heavy metal. Once they do escape, they wind up on a beach. They run across an old fellow named Socrates, which has somewhat of a very steampunk looking hat. They build a ship and they sail across to some island. Unbeknownst to them, it's a very magical land. You have the queen herself, which is an evil sorceress who has turned all of the men in the island into, big surprise, fishmen. So they pretty much just do her bidding. Anyone who has ever disobeyed her is a fishman or got turned into something else. There's also somewhat of a unrequited love story in which a prince who somewhat seems to look a lot like Geordi from Star Trek is in love with a woman who got turned into a wooden post. And The boys do meet up with somewhat of an island girl. They somehow just sort of meet up. They rise up against the queen because these boys, as well as the dog that travels with them, were also within prophecy. So everyone is pretty much going out of their way to silence them, get them out of the way, just kind of just get rid of them. During some of the fight sequence, or rather the kill sequences, the film does actually recycle footage from the original 1979 film, The Island of the Fishmen. Obviously they're in a forested area, but you cut to scenes where a claw is rising up out of the mud. They're obviously nowhere near a marsh or swampland type area. In one scene where a claw comes up and claws someone in the face, you see reeds in the background. That's very obviously the beginning of the original film. So I wouldn't say that, it was unclever of them to try to cut down by budgeting, but definitely the costumes used in the TV film are extremely subpar. The creatures in the original film were at least a little more believable. The costumes were a little bit more fluid-like. They looked like they were definitely designed to be used in the water. And the creatures' eyes definitely have this animatronic movement about them. From the creatures from this sequel, they pretty much just stay in place. They look like they're painted on, and I swear if you look closely enough, you can see a guy peeking out the creature's mouth. So definitely extremely obvious. The film itself does not come off as a horror film at all. It seems more like one of those horrible Charles Band Moonbeam type pictures. It's very poorly written dialogue, horrible story. It seems more like a kid movie. The dialogue, like I said, and the plot is extremely simplistic, but there really is no gore, no violence, nothing, worth writing home to mom about, but it's definitely a G-rated film, and it really does come off as extremely kid-friendly. I honestly did not enjoy that movie at all. I could not wait for it to be over. Once it finally did finish, I felt like I had to use mouthwash. It definitely leaves a sulfuric aftertaste. But that is pretty much all I have for you guys today, and I will talk to you later.